Today on Meanbrews, we're covering New England IPA. I had a lot of trouble finding data on this style the past 3 years, and I was really regretting having to do this video. However, this time when I went and searched, I found quite a few recipes where I could use the data. People seem to be very secretive of their recipes, but that seems to be changing recently. And I have some good stuff to present today, so stay tuned. Let's get right into it. We have 16 winning NEIPA recipes that I was able to find. 3 were best of show, 6 were gold, 6 silver, and 1 was award winning. Ironically, this style was only covered in the past, I think, about 5 years. So not a lot of historical data, but some quick evolution, as you'll see in a second. The BJCP style is 21B. It's a provisional IPA style. An American IPA with intense fruit flavors and aromas, soft body and smooth mouthfeel, and often opaque with substantial haze. Less perceived bitterness than traditional IPAs and always massively hop forward. Style is evolving very quickly. I think it's taken a while for people to figure out how to brew a good one, and you'll see some big variation between the styles, and I'll present all that in my slides going forward. The BJCP range for the original gravity is 1.060 to 1.085, and we saw a big sweep here from 1.044 to 1.082 with an average of 1.063. It seems to cover the single and double IPA in one provisional style. Right off the bat, we're seeing that bigger beers are making medals in competitions, or getting medals in competitions. So this is gravitated towards around 1.073. I'm going to stick with the 1.063 in my recipe, but feel free to go bigger with this. IBUs, I don't know if I trust this because a lot of the bitterness comes from the late hop additions, which don't really show up on the regular Tinseth calculation. But however, they range between 30 and 75 with an average of 56 on the high side per what BJCP says it should be. We are seeing, I didn't see a change in IBUs over time, but I did see, because the gravity is going up over time, a change in the gravity to BU-GU ratio from right about 1 to a little less than 0.8. So people are, I think, finding the right balance for this beer, which is a bigger beer with a lot of hop character. Color is right on the mean with about an average of 5. The malt type percentages, base malt is 80.3% of the grist on average, around 3% crystal, around 2% toasted malts, and around 15% adjuncts. I never really talk about this slide, but this is an important one. For pretty much all my recipes, I try to stick to these proportions and pick the malts that are most prominent in these proportions for the recipe. So I've had the most success in the competition trail doing this, so try to stick with around these percentages when you develop your own recipes. Base malts were quite varied. We had quite a few different base malts here. The most prominent was American two-row. About 70% of the recipes use an American two-row at an average of 63, but a huge range from 2% to 97% of the grist in various recipes. Next most prominent was Maris Otter or Golden Promise. 50% of the recipes used a Maris Otter or Golden Promise at around 50% of the grist, and that range again was pretty big. Between some recipes used 30% of the grist and some right around 95% of the grist. Next most prominent was a white wheat malt. 44% of the recipes used a white wheat. Smaller range, but an average of around 21% of the grist. Here was the peak. And then we had some others. We had a couple recipes used Pilsner, high percentage of Pilsner malt, and Munich Light over here. With about 3 recipes used about 10-15% Munich. And then we had Spelt, Oat Malt, and Red X as other base malts that were used in other recipes. Not very prominent. I wouldn't recommend using any of these last 5. The likelihood of using American two-row has gone up from about 53% to around 70% of the grist. So people are heading away from, I know early on people were saying to use Maris Otter as your base malt. That's kind of gone down. You do want a little bit of malt character in there, so a little bit of Maris Otter will help, but the majority of the recipes are using 2-row recently and being successful with it. Crystal and toast malts, the most prominent is honey malt. 31% of the recipes are using a honey malt, just above the threshold where I will use it in my recipe, at an average of around, 4.3% of the grist. Not a lot, just brings a little sweetness and honey character. Next most prominent is a carapils, carafoam, dextrin malt, all the same thing. 25% of the recipes at a big range of around 6% to 17% of the grist. The average was 10.8% here at the peak. Also had a light crystal used in a couple recipes and aromatic in one recipe. The use of crystal over time, this is going down. Obviously, people realize that the crystal carapils, crystal light crystal malts are not adding a lot to this beer, and people just aren't using it. So around 4% down to 2% of the grist is the evolution. I'm not going to use crystal in my recipe at the end. Adjuncts, the most prominent, 88% of the recipes use flaked oats. Big proportion between 6% to up to 40% of the grist was flaked oats. But the average is right around 18, probably about 18 to 20 would be the sweet spot here for flaked oats. Also had flaked wheat and dextrose and cane sugar used in a few recipes, but not enough to warrant putting it in at the end. Bittering hops that were used, quite split. Cascade and Magnum were the most prominent, with Warrior, Sots, Amarillo, Summit, and CTZ rounding it out. You'll see this doesn't add up to one. Not every recipe used bittering hops. In fact, the likelihood of using a bittering hop has gone down over time to just under 60% of the recipes are using a bittering hop addition. And if they are using a bittering hop addition, the IBUs contributed from that hop addition have dropped by half, from around 20 IBUs to 10. I am not going to use a bittering hop addition for this style. I don't think it's needed. And I think the trends are showing that it's really not necessary for this style. Flavor hop, very few recipes use flavor hop addition. We'll get to that in a second. But if they did, it was Citra or Apollo. Aroma hop, again, very few recipes use them. Amarillo and Mosaic were the most prominent. Azaka, Galaxy, and Citra rounded out the chart. In fact, the likelihood of you using aroma hop has gone down to 0 over time. Whirlpool hops, this is where your big hop charges come in, late addition and dry hops. Most prominent Whirlpool hops were Citra. 44% of the recipes used a Citra. 38% used Mosaic. 25% used Galaxy and Amarillo. The next most prominent were Vic's Secret and Idaho 7. And then a suite of other American-style hops here used in the Whirlpool. The Biotransfer hops, these are the hops that I'm going to call added during active fermentation at high Krausen. Citra, 50% of the recipes use Citra and 50% use Mosaic. 31% Amarillo. 19% Galaxy. 13% Ella. 13% Vic's Secret. And then some other American hops. So let's talk a little bit about biotransformation. It's purported that biotransformation is the transformation of a hop oil called Geranoil to beta-citronello. That brings out a citrusy type flavor in your beer. It only works for some yeast varieties are able to biotransform this, and it only happens in the presence of another hop oil in quantities that are necessary to create the metabolism environment for that hop oil, and that's linalool. So you have to have linalool to convert Geranoil into beta-citronello. That's the biotransformation theory. So when you look at hops that have a large amount of Geranoil, and it's spelled wrong, OIL, a large amount of Geranoil in milliliters per kilogram of hop, you see some pretty big standouts here that are commonly used in New England IPA. In fact, some that were used in the data. So Mosaic, CTZ, Comet, and Idaho 7. Mosaic has a very large, compared to the rest of the table here, a very large amount of Geranoil per kilogram compared to the other hops. And that's why I think Mosaic is one of the prime candidates to use for a biotransformation hop. You should note that you shouldn't just go ahead and pick some varieties because they have a lot of this compound in them. You want to pick ones that are pleasing for this style. So take a look at this list and see if there's any that you want to play with. I know Bravo, I know Sabro, and Denali is used a lot in NEIPAs, and there's a reason why, as they bring that biotransformation compounds into the mix. Linalool is the other compound that is used, is necessary, kind of a enzyme, you would say, for the other fermentation reactions. And again, we see a lot of the late edition hops that we saw in the Whirlpool in biotransformation, again, being used here. Most prominent, Galaxy and Mosaic. Again, Mosaic is an all-rounder. It's got enough of both compounds to help with the biotransformation, which is why I think it's perfect for this active fermentation hop addition. So after hop fermentation's done, a dry hop is put in to add that hop aroma. Citra is the most prominent. 56% of the recipes use Citra, 38% Mosaic, 19% Galaxy and Amarillo and Idaho 7, Vic Secret 13%, and then a slew of other late edition hops. The rate of hop additions, right at 94% of the recipes used a Whirlpool, Biotransform, and a dry hop addition. And they were all up here between 0.7 and 1.0 on the ounces per gallons. We'll show how that's evolving as well in the next slide. 0.7 to 1.0 ounce per gallons for each of those three additions. Only about 13% used a flavor hop addition, so not necessary for this style, and 25% used a aroma hop addition, right at around 0.5 ounces per gallon. Again, not prominent enough to use for this recipe. All right, so here's the change. This is a busy chart, but I'll walk through it. The red is the rate, ounce per gallon for the Whirlpool hops. The light blue is for the Biotransform, and the black is for the dry hops. And when you trend all these over time between 2017 and today, all of these are going to right around 1 or a little bit above 1 ounce per gallon for each of these additions. And you'll see my recipe reflect that in the end. And I think these are showing that you need to get enough hop matter in there to extract the volatiles and the hop oils that are really necessary for this style. So shoot for around 1 ounce per gallon for each of these additions. Whirlpool Durations, this is another intriguing one. The Whirlpool temperature, average temperature was 172 Fahrenheit, but the durations has gone up from around 18 minutes to around 30 minutes of a Whirlpool or a hop stand. So you'll see that reflected in my recipe as well. For the dry hop durations, we have, this is the secondary dry hop and the biotransformation dry hop. Right at 7 days for keeping in contact with the hops for the biotransformation, with a range between 4 and 10. And the secondary hop was a range between 2 and 7 with an average of right around 4 days. Not a lot of contact time, so keep that in mind. You don't want those grassy notes coming out with the longer contact time in the fermenter. We had one recipe use a step mash, but the vast majority used a single infusion. And the temperature for step mash used a protein rest at 122. I'm not going to recommend that. You actually want those haze proteins to make it through the final beer. And the alpha rest is 153 Fahrenheit or 67 Celsius for 61 minutes. Big range between 145 and 158. The mash duration ranged between 30 and 90 minutes, so we'll keep sticking with the 60-minute mash for this recipe. Boil duration was anywhere between 30 and 90 minutes with an average of 63. We'll stick with the standard 60-minute boil for this one. And the yeast, vast majority used the 1318. I think it's AO4 for Imperial. This is 44% of the recipes use 1318. 19% used White Lab 066, which is London Fog. I'm not sure what the brewery was there. 13% used the White Lab 644. This is the Sac Trois Diastaticus Sac strain. 13% used that. Conan was used in 13%. And Woodbred Dry, which is SO4 by Fermentis, 6%. And one Kvike beer, one a metal with Hornindal. You'll see that reflected in the temperature of the ferments coming up. Water chemistry, really important for this style. We had a water calcium between 32 and 140. Low amounts of magnesium. We're going to ignore these two. Not really important. One recipe did use 75% or 78% or 78 parts per million of sodium, stating they wanted to accentuate the sweetness with the salt, kind of like you put salt on watermelon. But that was far off the average, which is around 25 parts per million. The big number here is the ratio between chlorides and sulfate. Chlorides were right at 150 average, all the way up to 300 parts per million. I wouldn't go up this high. I think this is a sweet spot, and right around 75 parts per million sulfate. This gave you a 2.0 chloride to sulfate ratio, which is where I think you want to be. You want to be higher on the chlorides and the sulfate. Very important for this style, not to have a harsh bitterness. It needs to be soft. You need to accentuate not the bitterness, but the hop flavors. And this ratio is extremely important. If you don't know how to use, to calculate your waters, to adjust your waters, I recommend downloading Brew and Water and learning that software, getting a water report from your local municipality, and figuring out how to do this, because you will not be able to brew the best NEIPA you can without adjusting your water. Fermentation temperature, well, we had that Kvike beer down here, so I took that out to get the regular ale fermentation temperatures, and the average was 67 Fahrenheit or 19 degrees Celsius with the tight little band for the range between those recipes. Average carbonation volumes was 2.4 volumes of carbon dioxide. Here we go for the recipe. So we're going to start with pale malt, 2-row pale malt, 45.8% of the grist. It's going to be pale malt. Golden Promise is going to make up the next highest proportion, 27.7% of the grist, and 15.2% flaked oats. We're going to add 9.6% white wheat malt and 1.8% honey malt. That makes up our grist. Very light colored beer. This is the graphic from Beersmith that shows the color of this beer, right where I want it to be. For hop additions, we're going to add 2 hop additions at Whirlpool, Citra and Mosaic. We're going to add right around 0.55 ounces per gallon or 4.12 grams per liter of each. And we're going to do a hop stand of 30 minutes at 172 Fahrenheit. It says they're going to contribute about right around 30 IBUs to this beer. We're going to use White Labs or Y Yeast London Ale 3 1318, which is the Boddington strain, which is classic for this style. For our biotransformation hop, we're going to pick 3 hops. We're going to pick Amarillo, Citra, and Mosaic. And for each, we're going to put a third of an ounce per gallon each, or 2.47 grams per liter each, right at high crossing, 2-3 days into ferment. And then once fermentation is died down, so we can not bubble off those volatile hop compounds, we're going to add half an ounce each, or 3.74 grams per liter each, half an ounce per gallon, of Citra and Mosaic, and let them sit for 4 days after stable gravity is reached. Then we're going to transfer it to a keg and carb it up. We're going to shoot for about 1.063 original gravity. I'm not going to report the IBUs. Really don't trust these numbers, and just shoot for these amounts of hops per gallon, and you'll hit the style. For water chemistry, I'm going to go for about 80 parts per million calcium, 5 parts per million magnesium, 25 parts per million sodium, 75 parts per million sulfate, and 150 parts per million chloride. Again, important. This is very important for this style that you hit these numbers. Mash pH of around 5.3. We're going to do an infusion mash at 153 Fahrenheit or 67 Celsius for about 60 minutes. We're going to mash out and sparge and boil for 60 minutes. I'm going to do all my Whirlpool at the end. Don't forget that. When the Whirlpool's done, I'm going to chill to 66 Fahrenheit, 18 Celsius, oxygenate and pitch healthy yeast. I'm going to ferment at 67 or 19.4 Celsius and then ramp up to 69 when the fermentation slows. And that's it. Thank you for tuning in for this latest episode. If you feel like it, please subscribe or hit that like button. Going to put out another poll up for what the style will be next to cover. And if you do brew this beer, let me know in the notes. And happy brewing. Thanks. Bye-bye.